Tonight is different. A federal judge just exposed Trump's sealed verdict, and now Washington is in full-blown meltdown. Within hours of the files dropping, members of Congress from both parties are screaming for action. Not hearings, not letters, actual arrests. The cover-up is dead, the truth is out, and the evidence is so explosive, even Trump's own allies are starting to walk out. This is power colliding with accountability in real time. And the stakes are nothing less than democracy itself. Stay right here, because what's inside these unsealed files could trigger the biggest political collapse of Trump's career.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell here in Washington, and we are coming on the air as Special Counsel Jack Smith is delivering remarks on the indictment of former President Donald Trump any moment from now. Just over an hour and a half ago, the 38-count indictment was unsealed, 37 of them specifically targeting Mr. Trump. And the accusations made in this indictment are stunning. They allege that the National Archives repeatedly demanded that the former president turn over classified documents beginning in May of 2021. The charges against the former president include willful retention of national defense information, conspiracy to obstruct justice, withholding a document or record, corruptly concealing a document or record, and concealing a document in a federal investigation, scheme to conceal, and false statements. And
you don't get bipartisan calls for a president's arrest within 24 hours unless something truly extraordinary just landed on the table. This is not just another Trump headline, not just another scandal that lives and dies in a weekend news cycle. This is what it looks like when a judge takes files that were supposed to stay locked in the dark and says, no, the public gets to see this. When sealed evidence becomes public evidence, the stakes aren't just legal anymore. They're constitutional. They're about whether we still live in a country where the rules apply upward, not just downward. Let's strip this down to basics, because there's a lot of noise already. For years, the Trump classified documents case has been wrapped in procedure. Motions, redactions, sealed dockets, carefully worded no comment from the Justice Department. We all knew about the boxes at Mar-a-Lago, the FBI search, the indictment, the talking points. But the real core of the case, what investigators concluded about Trump's intent, who helped him, what he did after being told to return the documents, that's what lived behind those sealed files. That's what Congress now has in front of them. And that's what triggered this wave of panic, anger, and demands for action.
Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with felony violations of our national security laws, as well as participating in a conspiracy to obstruct justice. This indictment was voted by a grand jury of citizens in the Southern District of Florida, and I invite everyone to read it in full to understand the scope and the gravity of the crimes charged. The men and women of the United States intelligence community and our armed forces dedicate their lives to protecting our nation and its people. Our laws that protect national defense information are critical to the safety and security of the United States, and they must be enforced. Violations of those laws put our country at risk. Adherence to the rule of law is a bedrock principle of the Department of Justice.
Because this isn't about a mislabeled file folder or a sloppy transition out of office. This is about whether a man who swore an oath to protect the country treated some of its most sensitive secrets as toys, leverage, or trophies. It's about whether he knowingly obstructed efforts to get those materials back, and whether people around him helped cover it up. When a special counsel spends years digging, interviewing witnesses, comparing timelines, and then hands over a report so serious that the Justice Department itself wants Congress to see it, that's not politics. That's the system quietly saying, we found something we cannot ignore. What changed this week is that the quiet part isn't quiet anymore. A federal judge looked at those materials, weighed the arguments about national security and ongoing investigations, and still ruled that key evidence needed to be unsealed. Not rumor, Not leaks, not anonymous sources, evidence. And within a day of lawmakers reading it in secure rooms, you had members of Congress using a word you almost never hear about a sitting president from both sides of the aisle. Arrest, not censure, not stern letters, arrest. That tells you how far past the normal guardrails we are right now. From the pro-democracy side of this, the through line is painfully clear. For years, Trump and the MAGA movement have treated institutions like props. Courts are rigged when they rule against him and vindicated when they don't. Law enforcement is the deep state until they're arresting his enemies. Classified information is no big deal when it's in his bathroom, but a mortal threat when anyone else mishandles it. The constant drumbeat is simple. The rules don't really apply to him or his allies. They're weapons to use against everyone else. This unsealing hits that narrative right in the center because it asks a simple question. Do we actually mean it when we say no one is above the law? Look at who is speaking out. Jamie Raskin isn't some random backbencher. He's a constitutional scholar who has lived in the center of this storm since the first impeachment. When he says the Justice Department can't sit on criminality, he's not just making a cable news soundbite. He's drawing a bright red line between what the evidence shows and what the government is willing to tolerate. He's reminding DOJ that secrecy can't become complicity, and that if prosecutors flinch, Congress will own a piece of that failure too. On the other side, you have someone like Lisa Murkowski, a Republican willing to say out loud that sealed files cannot be a safe harbor for corruption. And that phrase matters, because in our hyper-tribal politics, breaking ranks with your own party's president is almost unheard of. Murkowski is essentially telling her voters, if the evidence is as bad as it looks, then party loyalty doesn't excuse it. That's a huge crack in the MAGA wall of denial. No, it's not the entire Republican Party suddenly rediscovering integrity, but it's a reminder that there are still people inside the GOP who understand that if you normalize this kind of behavior, you're not just protecting one man, you're rewriting the rules for every president who comes after him. Let's talk about those rules, because classified documents can sound abstract. These are not just fancy stamps on pieces of paper. They're information about military capabilities, intelligence sources, diplomatic strategies, things that, if mishandled, can get people killed or give adversaries leverage over the United States. There's a reason lower-level officials get prosecuted and jailed for mishandling this stuff. The system has to signal. Some lines cannot be crossed. If the president himself can treat that same information like personal property, ignore demands to return it, and then twist the legal process to cover his tracks, what message does that send to every colonel, analyst, and diplomat down the chain? This is where the unsealed report matters. It doesn't just list which documents were found where. It walks through patterns, the delays, the misleading statements, the boxes that moved, the lawyers who were allegedly instructed to sign letters that weren't true. It looks at state of mind, what Trump was told, what he knew, what he did anyway. That's the difference between a paperwork error and a crime. And if the report shows deliberate efforts to obstruct, mislead, or hide the truth, then we're not debating sloppiness anymore. We're debating whether the President of the United States actively tried to place himself outside the law. Now layer that on top of everything else we already know: a violent attempt to overturn an election, pressure on state officials to find votes, fake electors, efforts to weaponize the Justice Department itself for personal political gain, and now allegations that he treated national security information with the same rules are for other people attitude. None of these events lives in isolation. Together, they paint a picture of a leader and a movement that see institutions as obstacles, not safeguards. The Constitution as a suggestion, not a binding contract. This is why Congress is freaking out. Not because they're suddenly shocked that Trump pushes boundaries. We've all watched that for years. But because when you have a federal investigation spelling out evidence of possible crimes by a sitting president, and you've now read that evidence in black and white, Doing nothing becomes its own kind of decision. If they shrug and move on, they're not neutral. They're endorsing the idea that some people truly are untouchable. They're signing off on a two-tiered system where the powerful get secret exceptions. Politics, of course, is never far away. There are Republicans right now gaming out whether backing Trump through this will help them survive primaries and stay in power. There are Democrats calculating the electoral risk of moving too fast or too slow. There are consultants counting clicks and cable segments. But underneath all that petty noise, there's a simple civic question the rest of us have to keep asking. What kind of country are we willing to be? Because there are precedents for this kind of moment. We've had scandals before. We've had presidents lie, cover things up, abuse their power. What defined those eras wasn't perfection. It was whether people inside the system finally said enough and backed that up with action. Watergate didn't become Watergate simply because crimes were committed. It became Watergate because courts enforced subpoenas, because lawmakers of both parties eventually demanded the truth, because the president faced consequences instead of a quiet deal. This moment feels similar in one crucial way. Secrecy is cracking. For years, Trumpism has survived on fog, on uncertainty, spin, and the idea that the truth is whatever his base wants it to be that day. Unsealing this evidence cuts through that fog. It says, here are the facts. Here's the timeline. Here are the statements under oath. People can still spin how they feel about it, but they don't get to pretend the underlying reality doesn't exist. That's why you're seeing such a frantic backlash from MAGA media right now, because the easiest defense, we'll never really know, just got a lot harder to sell. The danger, of course, is that even overwhelming evidence can be shrugged off in a country that's exhausted and cynical. When you spent years watching scandals come and go, it's tempting to roll your eyes and say, nothing will happen. It never does. That's the emotional exhaustion authoritarian movements count on. If you can convince people that accountability is impossible, you don't have to win the argument ever again. You just have to outlast everyone's hope. That's exactly why this isn't just a story about elite institutions. It's about us. It's about whether we pay attention long enough to see this through, whether we hold our own representatives to their words when they say no one is above the law, whether we demand that the Justice Department, which asked for this report to go to Congress in the first place, follow where the evidence leads, not where political convenience points, whether we refuse to let this become background noise. For Trump himself, this is more than a legal problem. It's a legitimacy problem. You can't govern effectively when half the country is watching evidence that you may have broken serious laws and used your office to shield yourself. Every policy fight, every negotiation with Congress, every meeting with foreign leaders now carries that shadow. Is this a normal presidency, or is this a man clinging to power while the walls close in? That is not good for him politically, but more importantly, it's not good for the country. Because while Washington obsesses over the drama, people outside the bubble are dealing with rent, healthcare, climate disasters, gun violence, and 100 other real problems. This scandal doesn't make any of that easier. It makes it harder, because a government consumed by self-protection is a government that can't focus on anything else. Time spent arguing about whether the president can be prosecuted is time not spent solving the issues that actually define people's lives. That's the cost of impunity at the top. Our system stalls out right when we need it most. So where does this go next? Congress has options, none of them simple. They can open formal investigations, subpoena witnesses, hold public hearings that lay the evidence out for the country. They can refer matters to DOJ, turning up the pressure on prosecutors to act. In theory, they could move toward impeachment again, knowing how divisive that would be in a country already split down the middle. Or they can let the courts handle it quietly, hoping the legal system slowly grinds toward an outcome while they focus on other things. But do nothing isn't really on the menu anymore, not after this week's statements. They've already made this a test of their own credibility. For the Justice Department, this is a moment of truth as well. Jack Smith's job was to investigate and present the facts. That part is done. Now it's about choices. What to charge, who to charge, how aggressively to pursue accountability when the subject sits in the Oval Office. It's hard to overstate how unprecedented this is. There is no comfortable, well-worn path for prosecuting a sitting president for alleged crimes that touch national security and obstruction. Any direction they move will shape how future presidents are treated for generations. But here's the thing. Ducking that responsibility is also a decision with consequences. If DOJ decides that the practical risks of charging are too high, even in the face of strong evidence, they send a message that some offices do come with de facto immunity, that even if you technically can prosecute, you never really will, and every future president will hear that message loud and clear. The only stabilizing principle in a moment like this is the one authoritarian movements fear the most, the idea that the law is bigger than any individual, that we don't protect people just because they're loud, or powerful, or scary to cross. That in the end, institutions answer not to one man, but to the public and to the Constitution. That sounds abstract, but it shows up in very concrete ways in whether a judge unseals evidence, in whether a senator speaks honestly after seeing it, in whether voters demand something better than a constant state of crisis. So yes, this is about Trump, but it's also about us choosing which version of America we want to live in. In one version, a president can treat classified documents like souvenirs, stonewall investigations, and rely on a mix of fear, loyalty, and fatigue to avoid real consequences. In that version, every future president learns the same lesson. Push as far as you can, the system will fold before you do. In the other version, the evidence matters more than the personality. The process, however messy, still leads to some form of accountability. It might be slow, it might be imperfect, but it exists. Right now, we are standing between those two versions. A sealed verdict has been exposed. Congress has demanded action. A special counsel's work is no longer buried in redactions and closed-door briefings. The question is whether any of that will mean something, or whether it will be one more story we scroll past. Trump and the movement around him are betting on the latter, on the idea that we're too tired to care and too divided to act. We don't get to control what they do next, but we do get to decide whether we normalize it, whether we treat this like just another fight in an endless culture war, or as what it really is, a stress test of whether the rule of law is still real in this country. That's the choice in front of us, in this moment, with these unsealed files. And history is going to be very clear about which side of that line everyone chose.